today. This session is being recorded, so if you're interested in the contents or you want to share it with a friend, it will be downloadable from our website in a day or so. Only the host, that's me, and the presenters have audio in our webinars, and so we do have the chat box open. If you've got a question, just go ahead and type that into the chat box. I'll be monitoring that, and we'll remind our speakers if they've got a question that comes in that way. It's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Lynette Flage, and she's served as a community leadership specialist for North Dakota State University Extension from 2003 to 2011, where she worked with the North Dakota Horizons program on building local leaders and tackling difficult issues to build prosperity in rural and tribal areas. Her research interests include a sense of community, rural leadership, social capital, and community change processes. And she continues to do that now from a new role as Northeast District Director for NDSU Extension. So welcome, Lynette.
Thank you.
Then our second speaker is Dr. Scott Chazdon, who is also recently promoted. I don't know, these people, they just get promoted all over the place here. As Interim Associate Dean for the Center for Community Vitality, University of Minnesota Extension, and in that role he provides leadership for 30 center staff. Dr. Chazdon joined Extension in 2007 to lead performance management and evaluation for the Community Vitality Center. He's demonstrated experience in both qualitative and quantitative methodology and analysis, participatory evaluation strategies, and in conducting evaluation and research in diverse settings, including squatter settlements in Peru, offices of bank community reinvestment officials here in the U.S. He's got a PhD in sociology from the University of Denver and an MA in cultural anthropology from the University of Florida. So with that, I'll turn it over. I think Lynette is first, so the floor is yours.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Scott. And it's great to be here this afternoon. Thanks to all for joining us. I'm always amazed at the way this technology works, and I appreciate it very much. My home and office is in a rural area in North Dakota, and so this has been a way of many times that I have been able to present and collaborate with others. So thank you again for this opportunity. I'd like to begin this presentation just with a little bit of an overview on what we're going to be doing today over the next probably about 45 minutes. The last 15 minutes we'd like to have some time to chat in the chat box and ask you a few questions and get a little bit more feedback. But what we'd like to do is, what Scott Chazdon and I are going to talk to you today is really about a little bit of the background of this ripple effect mapping that we're going to talk about, and we're using it as an evaluation tool. There has been a lot of mapping recently done in Extension, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the other groups that are working with this technique, but we're just really going to focus on this ripple effect mapping and what it might be used for, again, within Extension organizations. We'll describe the method a bit for you, talk about some of the benefits and the limitations that we're learning as we use it more and more in the work as we evaluate different programs, and of course provide you with some examples, some ways that it has worked well for us, and again, not so well. There have been others, though, that have done some mapping in program evaluations recently, and I know that there was a webinar on this recently by a group that had done a lot of work with 4-H mapping. I'm going to talk about that a bit more in the future. And so it has been a popular item and something that we're all looking at more and more. A little bit of the background that we have been working with. Scott and I got involved with this. I actually went to the University of Minnesota and did some work for staff at their campus regarding this technique. And we had just had a great conversation and talked a lot about ways that we might want to use it in the future. But as we process this and learn more about it, ripples mapping is really an open-ended group interview. And it provides a lot of attention to the context and really takes a look at the concerns of our program stakeholders. This qualitative method is a participatory group. It involves and engages the participants really in the programs as well as other stakeholders. It's up to you who you want to invite, but we think it produces high quality evaluation data and really increases the likelihood of your participants to take some future collective action. When they see these maps up in front of them, they get excited about what's out there, and it really helps them move forward. It is kind of a form of mind mapping. There's a diagram. It's a process that you actually will be diagramming for others. It does represent connections hierarchically. And a fundamental concept behind Ripple's mapping is really this radiant thinking, which talks about your brain's associative thought process, and it derives from a central point. Every map's got that central point and then has links between the integrated concepts. And so we think it makes Ripple mapping an ideal tool for evaluation, which is how we've been using it, but also for brainstorming, memorizing, organizing. There's just a lot of ways that people like to mind map. We did use it initially in Horizons communities, and as Scott Loveridge mentioned, part of my previous responsibility was doing the program management of the Horizons project in North Dakota. We had 46 communities participate in this over a number of years, but their work was to build leaders locally to take action on issues. And afterwards, after the program was done at these local places, we went in and mapped many of them to see really what the intended outcomes, what happened, and a lot of the unintended outcomes, what happened that we didn't even expect. There are a lot of variations on how this was used. In Washington, Idaho, North Dakota, we all did this work, but this is really where we got started in the first place. There was a group, though, that also was very involved in doing some mapping earlier. Baker, Calvert, Emory, Enfield, and Williams did a lot of mapping, and their program was titled Contribution of 4-H Participation to the Development of Social Capital. And they really demonstrated, again, a mapping process that linked youth development to community development. So it's been very exciting to see how some of these things are unfolding. So we're going to talk today about how we used it, but then some of the variations that are being used across the states as well. Mind mapping is really, again, this radiant thinking, the note taking. You look at this picture on your screen and you think about ways that you may have taken notes in the past, and I think that that's what this individual was doing and really mapping out their notes to better understand. It's great for brainstorming, organizing, problem solving, evaluation. It really thinks about, again, how you're looking at a central point or a central issue or a central purpose and then forming the links between all of the concepts. I used to use it actually for note taking. One of my undergrad classes I took, I didn't know much about it. The teacher was fabulous, but everything was essay. When we turned around and did the test, it was all very, very much in-depth essay. And so I would practice by mapping it out on my note paper, so I was able to then turn around and write it. There's a lot of different, what we call close cousins really to our term of ripple effect mapping, and we've sort of coined this term, but there's a lot of different variations on this. Outcome mapping, concept mapping, there's another process called participatory impact pathway analysis. There's a lot of different evaluation approaches or even brainstorming and planning approaches that we take a look at and determine how suitable it really is for the context we're working. So these are, again, a lot of different evaluation processes. Outcome mapping is really, it's very close to this ripple effect mapping. Outcome mapping is really in regards to the design phase. A lot of times it's done up front. It's something that is being used in a number of development initiatives right now, very learning-based, participatory, but it's done on the principle that program efforts are most successful when continued responsibility to the project is given to local individuals or local organizations, and you map it up front. Concept mapping, very similar, yet another type of mapping. It's described as really a mind map that is branching out around a focus question. So you're really taking a look at a focus question. A concept map can really be a map, a system view, or an abstract system or set of concepts. They're a little more free form. There can be a lot of hubs and clusters created. There's not just necessarily just a center concept, but it's all over the map. And this participatory impact pathway analysis, yet another process that's out there that's used. It was actually used initially in 2006 in Ghana on an agriculture, food, and water project that they were using in that developing country. It starts off with a problem tree, and the tree really helps participants clarify the problems and opportunities that whatever program they're working on will address. It's very similar to a logic model, which many of us are used to, just done in a little different format. So again, just kind of what we call the close cousins. There's a lot of relatives of this ripple effects mapping. As you look through the literature, there are a number of different processes that are used. The way that we have set this up, that we used with Horizons and that we've used with other projects since then, we've been kind of referring it to this ripple effect mapping because of the process we used. I want to just give a little shout out to Deborah Hansen. Deborah Hansen's from Washington State University. She's developed some material specifically using this ripples effect mapping technique where we're using appreciative inquiry, we're doing the mapping, the mind mapping, and then actually categorizing according to the community capitals. So you'll see a little bit more about the process next, but Deborah Hansen has put together some nice material on that. Again, she's at Washington State and is finishing up with those items as we speak, so that that's available for others to use. And she's been a great partner as we've worked through this process in Horizons. Scott, could I have you pull over the mapping question? Has anybody used mapping before? I'm just trying to get a little feel for this. Have you ever used a mapping process? Doesn't matter if it's been outcome or concept or participatory, anything. Have you ever used a mapping process before to plan programs, brainstorm, evaluate? Or if you haven't used it, certainly go ahead and check that as well. But check everything that applies to you. And we're watching the responses come in. I don't know if we're able to pop that up, Scott. It looks like it's slowing down a little bit. But many of you, it looks like, have used it certainly to brainstorm. And it's a great way to do that and to plan programs. And really, as we do use logic models in our organizations, it certainly is something that we have used often. We just don't really see it necessarily as a map that radiates out. Thank you. Thank you for that. Just a little bit about the process. And before we move it into a little more specific, ripple effect mapping is important to understand or to have a purpose for your map. Definitely you need a purpose. What is it that you're planning to do? What is that you're trying to understand? Instead of just putting something in the middle and saying, all right, let's talk about this program. What is it about the program you're really taking a look at? The mapping also is completed post-program. We're using it more at the back end of the programs as an impact evaluation, but it certainly can be used, of course, to brainstorm, to plan, all kinds of things. But we're going to talk about it and really focus on it as an evaluation tool today. We did use it when we did the Horizons program. We really looked at the bigger outcomes of the program. Were the things that we expected to happen coming up in the maps from the participants in focus groups? And then what were the other things they started to talk about? You'll see a couple of examples of maps that we really will frame up the purpose for you so you understand why it is, again, that you're doing this. Think about the objectives of your specific extension programs. Whenever you've got a program you're doing, maybe an objective is to increase community and civic involvement following leadership training. You can map that out. Sit down with your participants, have a small focus group, and ask them, let's talk about, is there increased community and civic involvement? Tell me about what it is. What does it look like? What are you doing? Who is it affecting? Just a lot of ways to ask those questions, but understanding the purpose up front is so critical so that you know exactly what it is that you're going to be mapping. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Scott.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how the process works. Before I do that, I should mention that, and Lynette mentioned, she came to Minnesota last summer and did an in-service for about 20 people here and got us really thinking about using this method to evaluate some of our deeper end, more involved programs in community vitality. And it seems like a great fit for a lot of the work we do. We've specifically used it with our Business Retention and Expansion program. We're going to be using it a lot with our leadership programs. And I've actually, as I'll talk about in a moment, tried it out just so I would get skilled up with a nonprofit organization here in St. Paul, of which I'm on the board, just so I could get some experience and see what this process can do. But the key things about how it works are here on the screen. One of the sort of obvious things is you have to have an intervention that is in-depth enough to have ripples, to have multiple effects, both intended and unintended, in the community that you're focusing on. And sometimes you hear about these kind of effects anecdotally in programs, and you think, oh, I wish I had a way to capture some of that information. And this is a terrific method for really documenting what has gone on in a community as a result of an extension program, as a result of the energy triggered oftentimes by the extension program. Another kind of intervention that is a good one to think about are collaborations involving multiple organizations. And yes, it gets tricky in terms of who did what, but collaborations are often very deep in terms of the ripples, in terms of the many multifaceted things, ripples and effects that come from the program at the community level. So the logistics are fairly easy compared to a lot of different kinds of research. You schedule a group meeting event and invite participants. Now, coming up with the list is a little tricky. You need to think about participants from the program as well as other stakeholders who can bring to the discussion a certain amount of truth-telling and validation of what the participants say came from the program. And I'm going to talk more about that sort of validation in a minute. But you want to think about a mix of direct participants and indirect community stakeholders. This helps really get at the sort of public value, because public value is that value in a community beyond the people we directly reach. So to have those external stakeholders is important. You conduct your actual discussion group. And I've tended to use the word discussion group rather than focus group because really this is almost the opposite of focusing. It's very divergent in terms of the mapping process. People go in all sorts of different directions in terms of the ripples or effects in the community. So I tend to call them discussion groups. And that session is usually about 2 hours. You have to basically conduct that group interview. During the process of the interview, you do the map live. If you prefer to do it on paper, you can, but you can also use computer software and a data projector to do it right in front of them on a screen. And then there is a process of cleaning up these maps, collecting supplemental data, which I'll talk a little more about, coding the data into some meaningful framework. Lynette mentioned the Community Capitals framework for community development work. That's a very meaningful framework to think about. But in other contexts, you might want a different framework. For example, a triple bottom line kind of framework might be useful for some sorts of initiatives. And the data analysis piece is something you want to think about. It can be done typically quite easily in Excel, because the data from a lot of these maps can be easily dumped into a program like Excel. I mentioned this is kind of an emergent practice, and so what we're talking about today is our experience so far, and we hope to trigger a lot of really good thinking about ways to do this and best practices. But we've noticed some variation so far in the way we go about this. In terms of recruitment, in the first column, you can think about recruiting program participants or other stakeholders from the community. They could be local elected officials who are not direct participants. They could be members of a chamber. They could be other stakeholders who the participants know, almost as in a 360 kind of review. People who knew the participants and knew the things that they had done as a result of participating in the extension program. There could be some other strategy for recruitment that we haven't even thought about yet that the participants in today's webinar might think of. In terms of the actual process, this process that was done with Horizons that we've been using started with appreciative inquiry questions, which really have been useful. We pair up the participants and they interview each other with questions that really get them to identify ways that they've changed as a result of the program. It's actually quite personal to get started. And that discussion then gets shared with the whole group, and that starts the mapping process with the whole group. And then during the actual mapping process, there's probe statements that should be written in advance, questions to get the group going. Often you don't need to do a lot of probing because people start just jumping in with ideas of impacts of things that have happened in their communities. And the big challenge is sometimes actually just keeping order in the room. You can think about probes around the community capitals, which we have done. You can also not probe specifically around the capitals and just save those as coding, as part of your coding for afterwards. So that's what I mentioned as free flow. You can not steer people towards the capitals, or if you choose to, or if you have reason to, you can steer them that way. In terms of coding, I mentioned you can use the capitals framework. You can code in terms of typical short, medium, and long-term outcomes that we know about from the extension's logic model. You can think about the triple bottom line as I measured, or the three legs of sustainability, equity, economy, environment. There's all sorts of possibilities depending on the content of your program in terms of how you might want to code the data. I'm going to share an example that is not really from extension, but is a foray into ripple mapping that I did, as I mentioned earlier, just to get myself familiar with how the process works. This is just one tiny corner of a map, ripple map, that ended up being printed 4 feet wide. And there's so much in it, so much came out of it. This was an initiative of a social service agency here in St. Paul that works in the Jewish community with seniors as well as with other residents in 2 neighborhoods of St. Paul. And they had an initiative that was called the Naturally Occurring Retirement Communities Collaborative. So it was a collaborative with a bunch of community agencies all about helping seniors stay in their homes with supports if that was a possibility for them. And what this initiative led to was huge. This whole map, as I mentioned, is 4 feet, or I printed it 4 feet wide. The biggest things it did had to do with social capital impacts in terms of strengthened networks among community organizations. It had huge kind of cultural capital impacts in terms of deeper connections, in this case with the Jewish community in St. Paul and the Russian-speaking Jewish community. So it produced a whole bunch of new services at this agency in terms of translating materials to Russian and providing services in Russian to meet that audience. And then all these amazing arts connections, which are shown on this map, where the social service agency started to work with arts organizations, and which led to all sorts of interesting connections. And ways of engaging seniors with youth, which were particularly important, ways of engaging seniors in mental health services by having them organized around something positive like the arts. This particular map has been enormously helpful to the board of that agency, of which I am a member, but it's been particularly helpful to the staff as well to see what happened as a result of their hard work, and to the partners in terms of how powerful of a collaborative this was, and it energized them to keep the collaborative going even without as much funding as they may have had in the past. So that's one example that's not very extension-y, but here's another example that Lynette is going to talk about.
There's a
and
question
thanks,
from
Scott.
Art
This one,
about resources on the triple bottom line. I don't know if you can paste something in there for her.
I'd be happy to do it afterwards, but I think that if you just were to Google triple bottom line, I'm guessing you'd come up with some pretty good resources. The idea of sort of money and social mission and environmental impact.
Yep. Thank you. Good question. And the next map that you're looking at, or the map that you're looking at now, is one of the communities that participated in the Horizons program in North Dakota. This is located on a Native American reservation in the south central part of our state, and many maps were done in each community to really map the impacts, both intended and unintended, of the Horizons program in each community. So we've got multiple maps all over. If you've ever done something like this, it is a lot of fun. I'm just taking a little piece of it, and so I'm sorry, I see a note from someone asking to make it bigger. I don't know if it's possible, and I know you're not able to really read it. We wanted to just show you, though, what these looked like as you put it into some computer software. When we did these maps in North Dakota, and I know Scott did this too, we did it all out on big white paper across the room, markers, lots of fun, very colorful. People get excited, and sometimes the room does get a little wild because there's all these great ideas coming out and you can't even record it fast enough. At other times, though, I have facilitated it where I've done it on the white paper in front, but at the same time someone has been right at a computer mapping it out on the software, and we'll show you a few examples of the software in a couple of slides. But that way you've got the map right in front of you as well, and you've got that software piece, and it is a little easier to follow along and read and make those connections. This is just a section of the map, though, for the Fort Yates Horizons program. The map spreads out quite a bit. It's not as big as Scott's 4-foot one was, but it's really fun to see some of the things that people start talking about. They're having new relationships with partners. There's more happening around visioning, and they're having safe places for people to gather. There are community kitchens being built and community gardens happening after a process that people were involved in. And so all of these things start to ripple out, and people would talk about them. I would continue to probe with questions as the facilitator, just basically asking them to get more detailed, tell me more, what's happening there. And this is what, this is again just a piece of a map that you begin to come up with.
And Barb had a question about the optimal size of the group to involve in this.
You know,
good question.
I neglected to answer that. It was one of my slides. We've gone with 8 to 15 people as the size of the group you'd want. You definitely want a minimum of 8. Depending how you organize it, you could go a little bit bigger than that, but you have to keep in mind that it's a group process, and too many people in the room would make it very, very difficult to manage. One other thing that has come up is sometimes during the discussion, people will be identified who know things about what has happened in a community, and they may not be in the room. You can go back and collect additional data from those people afterwards. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Yep. The slide that you're seeing now, of course, is the community capitals model, or the framework that many people have used in the past, and this is something that, as the Horizons communities completed their mapping processes in the 3 states, Idaho, North Dakota, and Washington. Horizons did happen in more states. We just did this little test, though, on the mapping for the evaluation process. The 3 states did, and learned a lot from each other, but we did go and do our coding based on the community capitals model. And so we were able to kind of put everything together from those 3 states and see what happened across the board, and were there similarities, were there differences, really, again, according to the capitals. So this was a great model to use. This is a great framework to use. In one of the states, in Idaho, the questions and the probes were actually for the small group, for the focus groups or the conversation groups, were around the capitals. And in Washington and North Dakota, we just kind of had more of a free flow discussion and mapping process, and then they were coded afterwards. So there was a couple different ways, a couple different techniques. As Scott mentioned, there's a lot of variations to this, and you do, again, what fits your program best and what you're most comfortable with. This is tiny, and again, I apologize for this. It's just kind of show you what happens, but once a map is completed, if you're using a specific mapping software, usually there's a quick and easy way to dump it in to an Excel spreadsheet or some other document that you can begin to code from. So this is the Fort Yates Horizons, just a little chunk of the map. Again, I'm just showing you a few of the items that were on the map, and what's nice about it is it easily jumps into Excel line by line. So cell by cell on your map will come into your Excel spreadsheet line by line, and then we were able to code it by the capitals model. So up on top I've got natural, cultural, human, and social columns. The others are off on the right that you don't see, but we also coded it by short, medium, and long-term outcomes. So we were able to really take a look according to our logic model, you know, was this fitting? The short-term outcomes, were there changes in people's knowledge or skills? Were they more medium-term as they described them, changes in their behavior, or more of a long-term outcome, really a change in their value, condition, or status? And so it was nice to be able to do it both ways. We began to tally things and, again, collaborate a bit with other states that had done this mapping and talk about what it is that we were seeing, intended and unintended outcomes across the board.
There are a couple questions that have come in. One is about the name of the software that you're using to generate the map, and then also what are the codes mean there under, it looks like natural, cultural, human, social.
Yep.
What is the
and
M?
the S is for short term, medium for medium term, and L for long term outcomes. So we had a couple of individuals looking at all of these to really cross tabulate, were we feeling confident and comfortable about the outcome that they were listed in, as well as which of the capitals to list. The software that we used, we actually used something called XMind, and in a couple of slides you'll see some examples of software. We're not trying to promote one or the other, but we did want to share a few types of software with you. XMind is free, but there is a small fee if you'd like the professional version, which will easily make it into a PDF map for you and easily start dumping it into Excel. So it's very inexpensive, $50 a year. I mean, but there are some other options as well, and we'll show you some of those in a couple of slides.
I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the benefits and limitations of this process. There's a lot of benefits. It's simple, it's inexpensive. Those are sort of a very big deal to begin with, because a lot of impact evaluation work can be very time consuming and very, very complex, involving many players. The activities are connected to a larger purpose. When you gather people together to do the ripple map process, you're not just extracting information from them as part of your evaluation. You are engaging with them and potentially triggering more ripples and more interesting things happening in that community as a result of even doing the evaluation. It helps you get at the public value because you're able to get beyond the direct participants in your program and think about the things that have happened as a result of their efforts in the community. And so any good impact evaluation would get at that public value, but this is just one method that is potentially very useful. Considering what is still needed. So it's not like you just identify all the great successes, but you also identify in this process things that kind of fizzled out. And you can start the process of asking why they fizzled and what might need to happen in order to either recreate that effort or start some other effort to address the problem that was there in the first place. But because this is a more engaged evaluation, you can grapple with engaging people in thinking about further solutions or other solutions. The hopefulness I mentioned, it's very positive. The energy in the room when you do this is extremely positive. People are very appreciative of receiving this map as a tool that they can continue to work with. It gives an opportunity for reflection and growth, not just for the people involved in the community, but also for the extension staff, and thinking about very directly about what actions on their part led to the biggest ripples, the biggest impacts in the community. The value, as I mentioned, the community gets a sense of ownership over this map. They can put it on a website. It can be shared, as I mentioned in my example of the board members sharing it. They shared it with funders in that case of that organization. In the case of extension, this could be shared with local officials. There's a lot of possibility here. It's graphic. It's not something that is very difficult to explain to people. So there's a very big advantage to this format in terms of public relations. The group validation I mentioned earlier, you could be concerned with a process like this that you're just cherry picking, that you're just asking for the positive stories, and that the people who come might be overstating perhaps the results or attributing too much credit to extension or to the program. That's one of the reasons why both in the process and in terms of who you recruit, you want to think about having people in the room who would be in a position to say, well, actually this other entity is the one that caused that change to happen. And you want perhaps that other entity to show up on the map somewhere so that you can say, well, perhaps the extension program was a catalyst or triggered something that another group had already started, but you want to be able to show those connections. And this mapping process does allow you to do that. You also, in terms of validation, do want to give instruction during the process that you're not just looking for just the cherry picking process. You're looking for critical thinking around the attribution of cause. And people can do a pretty good job with that, telling you the chain of causality and really talking it through with each other. And I found that to be true in the cases I've done so far. You do really capture outcomes as well as these impacts, some that were unintended, which I think is really powerful. So I think with that, I'm going to sort of move to some other ideas around, well, this idea of indirect impacts and social capital. I've been with Extension for a little over 5 years, and I came to Minnesota after some big changes were made with how Minnesota is organized. And I've always gotten the sense that local extension educators have a history of being very strong builders of social capital, but have not taken a lot of credit for it. And I think this process of ripple mapping really does highlight the ways that extension programs build social capital. And sometimes it should be actually part of the intended goals of programs, and it should go into those logic models. But if it's not in the logic model, it'll show up afterwards in the ripple map when you go back in and look at what has happened as a result of an extension program. So that's one reason I'm really supportive of this effort, is because I've been particularly interested in the social capital impacts of extension work. Some limitations I'd like to mention, because there certainly are limitations. This is not the be-all and end-all. there's certainly a bias and a risk of bias in who you select for, that should say participant selection, by the way, sorry about that, in who you select to invite to the session. This is not a kind of evaluation where you want to pick on purpose naysayers to invite to your group. But you do have to be aware that the people you invite will have a particular slant about the program, and you want to be at least probing for things that happened in the community as a result of the program that weren't so positive. And also, when you invite people, you want to look at your list and make sure you're representing, in our case, I would try to represent a cross-section of sectors of the community so that you have not people just from one sector, for example, from people who work with children or people who work in small business. You want to sort of have local government people, you want to have business people, you want to have folks involved perhaps with religious institutions, but you want to reach into as many sectors of the community as you can to encourage or to produce a more valid process. The people who you invite may not have complete information. One way around that is to actually probe for names of people who might have more information about some of the ripples and interview them afterwards and add that information to the map. One thing is, the last item on there was
this slide just really shares again a few examples that we've used the mapping with. I'm watching the time, and I see a lot of questions too. And
the validity issues with the data, but there's also some concerns about reliability. If, for example, you're conducting ripple mapping with a bunch of offerings of the same program, you want to make sure you're using a very consistent process across all those ripple map meetings. You want to
this might be a good place to answer Melanie's question, because she's on this consistency. She was wondering about the kinds of questions that you ask and how you lead the group in providing this kind of information. So I think that question does go to the consistency piece that you're talking about now.
It does. I mean, we can talk more about some of the kind of probe questions that we've used maybe in the discussion later on, but I think for now I want to emphasize that if you're rolling this out and you are evaluating a bunch of offerings of the same program, you certainly want to follow the same protocol and possibly even have the same people conducting the process, because there's a lot of variability that you would introduce just by having different people. And I know we have a slide later on actually about some of these issues, so I don't want to sort of go too far into that, because I know we're going to come back to that one. But I think we should, I don't know, Lynette, maybe we'll just make sure to talk a little bit about some examples of questions that have gotten discussions going. Okay.
Yep. I think that's great. And here this slide just shows again some examples of mapping and where different mapping has been used. I see Michael Darger at the University of Minnesota, the BR Business Retention Expansion Map. They have done some work there. He's even talked about that a bit in some of the in the chat area. Scott mentioned his social service collaborative, leadership programs. We've done some mapping. The Horizons program, we talked about that. The 4-H program mapping that the group did, really looking at 4-H and its relationship to social capital. There's just been a lot of different examples that are out there that we've shared throughout. I did want to make sure you saw some of these mapping software options quickly. I know that this presentation will be on the North Central Rural Development Center's website afterwards, and so you can pull these off at that point. We have been using the XMind one, but there are many others. We're not trying to say one is better than the other. There's just a lot of options. There's a lot of creativity you can put behind these, but they're pretty easy to use. They're really slick and a fun way to do this evaluation. Scott just mentioned about, really making sure that we have this reliability and validity, and some of the suggestions that we have is to be consistent, use the same facilitator, recorder, and mapper. We found a lot of, when you don't do that, you really can get some interesting maps, especially if you're going to multiple sites. Understand you will be probing for responses. Think about some of that beforehand. We do have a really simple little one-page handout that has some of our basic questions. They're using an appreciative inquiry process where we'll just ask people to share a little story to their partner about the program being evaluated or mapped, you know, and tell us a little bit, what are you proud of? What changed? Were there new ways to work? What did you learn? Were there some cost savings? You know, just we've got some basic probes, and I will also send that on to Scott Leverage to put with this presentation, so you can certainly use that. It's got a little bit of description of the process. Make some decisions, though, prior to mapping, whether to use the community capitals as probes or some other way that you're going to analyze this. You have to think about that up front, of course, so that's going to help you develop those probes initially. Recognize, you know, extension isn't trying to take credit for all of the change, and sometimes that helps to inform the group of that, but the program that you're doing is really what you're trying to see. How was this instrumental in making some of this change happen? And it is important to probe for negatives. There might be some things that you have to ask about when you think about next steps. There might be some things that you don't want to do again, and so that's certainly something to think about.
This really started with Lynette coming to Minnesota and giving us a bunch of training here that got us really excited about this, and we started to think, wow, we would love to see people doing this across extension and in other programs as well, but starting to employ this process of ripple mapping, start talking about it, start writing about it in journals. We have, working with Deborah in Washington State, drafted an article for the Journal of Extension that we're hoping will get published soon, that is just a tools of the trade sort of overview of the process, because we just wanted something to get out there about this method in a journal, so people can start referencing it, improving it, adding their own take on how this should be done. And you know, there's conferences like the American Evaluation Association that has an extension topical interest group where this stuff could be talked about, as well as all of the extension professional organizations. So we would love to see this method coming up in papers and used for scholarship for extension professionals in a variety of areas. I think there's just a lot here that people could grab onto and run with. And that is our hope. So we had written some discussion questions here. Oh, Michael mentioned, one of my colleagues here, that he was part of this initial training with Lynette, and he has taken this and run with it. He's going to be talking with BRNE International about his use of the method. So yeah, let's spread the word about this tool. Some things that have come up that are kind of interesting are, can you do this virtually? We've used this in communities of place, with programs in communities of place, but we've not ventured into using this method with a different kind of community, or a sort of a virtual community, or a program that is not in a community of place. So something to perhaps explore. Is this more of a method or a methodology? The reason we put that question in there is because this is definitely a method that is developed. It's informed by qualitative research methodology. And so the question is, is this a single method with a single approach, or is there a variety of ways that one can use this idea of ripple mapping? And I've already gotten into some interesting conversations with other scholars and other evaluators about how strict we should be about the processes here. And I just think it would be good to have a dialogue about what counts as ripple mapping and what doesn't. What interventions might be good candidates? I think there's just some really good ideas that this group may have for interventions that they could try this approach with. And then questions for you to think about as you think about doing this process is, who would you invite? What kind of mix of participants and stakeholders, and what kinds of questions would you ask? And as Lynette mentioned, she can post and will post some her questions that she's used. I could also post the questions that I've used, which were largely based on hers, but also some of the ideas I have for probing around the capitals that I would also be happy to post. And with that, it looks like we've got a lot of questions to start talking through.
Yeah, I keep expanding the chat box so that you can see them, which is good. You know, it's good that there's a lot of dialogue around this. So I don't know if you want to just kind of pick a few of these and go with it. For example,
I noticed one Dan had, I noticed this one, really a tiered impact question, and I think these are great examples. We'll put the one-pager, I'll send that on to Scott Loveridge, and it's just, again, some of the questions that we've used to probe, and then it describes the process. It's a really simple little one-page handout. But this is, this is what this conversation's about today, is to really think about some other ways you could ask these questions, and I thought this was great. It was looking at a tiered impact question, what would have not occurred without this project or effort, or what was supported by this project or effort. I mean, there's a lot of great examples out here of other ways to kind of ask those questions to start the ripple map. And so every time you do it, you'll come up really with some other examples. And many of you have done a number of evaluations in the past that you kind of like certain ways that you've asked things, whether it's using an appreciative inquiry process or a little different process, whatever you so choose. But it's just to try to get people to talk about what are some of those outcomes that are happening on from the program, intended and unintended. So I think there's some good suggestions here.
I would just respond to the Jason's comment about this being useful for summative. I tend to think of it actually as a much more of a developmental approach to evaluation, because you can go back to the community 1 year later after you do this. I mean, there's nothing sort of there's no reason why this would need to be the end product or the be-all end-all statement about a program, especially because we know a lot of extension programs, the ripples will occur for years afterwards, especially if you build social capital. So I see this very much as a developmental evaluation tool.
I thought Ardith had a very interesting question too. You got the sort of the appreciative inquiry and negatives kind of mixed in there. How do you deal with that? Sort of the question.
I can say that we started, I see the sort of philosophical issue. We started the discussion, the one I showed with this Jewish Family Service and their collaborative. We started the discussion with the appreciative inquiry questions and got to the negatives sort of later in the process. And it was to really sort of balance out, all these wonderful things have happened. Is there anything that happened that really wasn't so wonderful? And I guess I felt like it was an important balancing moment in the discussion. And we came back to positive things after that, but we were able to identify some things that came from that people really did kind of want to talk about, and some people in the room in particular really wanted to talk about. And I think that was important.
What about Melanie's question of which was similar to one that I wanted to ask as well, is you do this whole process, and then how do you boil that down to something that you can take to a decision maker? Kind of what's the one pager, how do you take it to that summary of what transpired in that program after you've done the mapping process?
You want to go first, Lynette?
Well, I don't know if I've got a great answer there. We've shared the map with decision makers to a point where they can see, a big section of it and talked about it. And they actually really liked that. They liked it just as much as a written document, paragraph form, because they could really see the effects in almost a bulleted fashion of what had happened. Very deep and meaningful effects of it all. But on another side, though, you certainly do have to present this in a way that's readable by all. And so we have used some of the, I guess, most, I don't know how to say it, even the biggest effects, or something that had really come up that we didn't expect at all, and written further about that, or even quantified it by using, you know, the number of social capital items and the human capital items and the build capital items and all of these things. And you start looking quantitatively at all of this, it can become really massive and huge and quite impressive as well. So we'd write about, you know, quantitatively, here's how many times people were talking about social capital change or something that affected the social capital, and talk about it that way. So it just, you know, there's kind of a variety of different ways we have been sharing it with others. Still kind of in learning mode there, though. So I don't know, Scott, you've got some examples of how you've done it.
Well, I think what's interesting when you quantify, you code by the community capitals and quantify, you know, there's questions that come up about where that count came from, because this really is a qualitative approach, not intended to produce a number. And what's useful about the numbers when you quantify is actually what are the numbers in the different buckets? In terms of the different capitals, where do you see the biggest numbers of things going on? So in some offerings of a program, for example, you might see big political capital numbers and changes. And in some offerings, you might not see that. You might see much more around cultural capital. And you can start to really ask questions about why those results happened the way they did. But I also think when you start to code it and count it, then you can give really good examples of each category. You can create a table that's easy to read for people as an alternative to the whole map.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, there's a lot of stuff.
Well, I saw earlier, too, that there were some people that were presenting on the spider mapping and looking at the 4-H impacts that we discussed earlier, too. And so there's some names. I know Barb Baker was one of the individuals that worked on the 4-H group, and she's got her email up there. And so please connect with them as well. I mean, they've done this as well, just a lot of different aspects of this mapping that we would encourage people to talk to others about. And we, again, are just trying to kind of push the process, think about this, and then, of course, put it into your own context, whatever it is that you might be able to use it for. We've used it in a variety of ways, and as have others, but we just think it's a really great way to get some extension impacts out there, as well as get the people that you're working with, the program participants, really ready to kind of move on. They see these maps and they get very excited about what's next, or wow, we didn't quite finish that, and we need to move further. And so I think it's just really a neat way to have that conversation continued.
In answer to Jason's question, I will email this chat thread to our presenters, and if you want a copy, just be in touch with them, and I'm sure they'll email it on to you.
Okay.
There was a comment too about going deeper. So once you've done the map, if you want more of a quantitative data set, and you want to say more about the impacts in a community, you can use the Ripple map to identify areas where you might want to go and do a survey or a more comprehensive analysis of your outcomes, where you're including a larger number of people from the community, for example, in a survey, and able then to generalize from the results. So that was a really great insight, that this Ripple map is qualitative, and it only does the things that qualitative research allows it to do. And you can then go back and test a hypothesis with quantitative research, and that's a great idea.
Yeah. Well, that's great. We're kind of at the end of our hour. Did you have more slides, or is this it?
Oh, no, that's it.
Okay.
Well, we had a couple just of
contact information.
Mainly our references, our contact. Yep.
Good. I think that's helpful. I think, obviously there's quite a bit of interest in this. I've got a few more minutes. If you folks want to stay on the line a little bit longer, we can just kind of watch the chat box and answer questions that come up. But I did want to note that we are at the end of the hour in case you do have other things you have to do. So, and I'll put up the webinar evaluation poll too, and hopefully people can let us know what they thought on those questions while they're looking at stuff coming in on the chats. So we'll start that going. So.
Well, and we only ask if people are going to give this a try to write it up and share it, so that we can really start having a discussion in the literature that people would be reading around use of this method and what it triggers.
And should they be in touch with you if they're interested in participating in the community of practice?
Sure.
Sure. We haven't started this, but we just thought it would be it's just a really great tool. We think it just fits our organization well.
Yeah, we'll have to think about try to figure out a good way to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, clearly you touched a nerve here with good participation from around the region and beyond. I saw people from some of the other regions, Maine and Penn State were on as well. So it's of interest to the whole system, I think.
Well, we may have to come ask for a small grant from you, Scott.
Well, there you go. Yeah. Why not?
Well, I'll send that